Okay, tonight is Q&A. So
I was reading your work, and you talk about the Kuzari principle.
very dangerous thing to do. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So the Kuzari principle basically states that anything that's significant, which is seen on a national level or large numbers, can never be forgotten.
No, it doesn't say that. Doesn't say anything about never being forgotten. It says if there is a national tradition about a national experience that's significant, then it's true. It doesn't say anything about being forgotten.
But then can't somebody say, let's say we come along, and let's say according to a theory that people like to put forward, that Ezra made up the Torah, and he comes to the Jewish people and he says, this is the Torah which you had. Yeah, and they say to him, we never heard of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he says, that's because you forgot. You're saying that you can forget it. Then he'll say to them, you forgot. But here we are, I remind you of it.
But it doesn't happen.
Doesn't? Why not? You just said you can forget it. If Ezra could always say, you forgot.
You've misunderstood the entire nature of the principle. The principle is not, golly, I don't think that can happen. The principle is not a confession of astonishment. When I think of that, I just can't imagine it happening. And they say, well, I can imagine it happening. The principle is not about your imagination. The principle doesn't say anything about your imagination. The principle says those sorts of things don't happen. To challenge the principle, you've got to find real cases that really happen. You said not thinking up how it might possibly happen.
No, you say it can be forgotten.
Sure.
Right, so now I'm asking that there's another way. It could have, if it can be forgotten, there's another
But you
way.
are talking about what could have happened. You just said could have.
Right.
And I'm telling you could have doesn't count.
So why couldn't it happen?
Again, couldn't happen doesn't count. And you say, why couldn't it happen? I'm telling you, couldn't have doesn't count. It's not relevant. What could or couldn't happen is not relevant. I agree it could have happened. I agree it's anything possible. Leprechauns are possible also. Possibility is cheap. I always give it away, and it counts for nothing. The fact that something's possible concludes nothing. It gives you no reason to believe or disbelieve anything. No one's saying that it's not possible. What I'm saying is it doesn't happen. Not it couldn't possibly happen, but it doesn't happen. In the real world, it doesn't happen. Well, I don't know. I've just done a survey and found that in every case where we know there was a national tradition, and we've been able to check whether it's true or not, it turns out to be true. That's the way people are. That's the way cultures are. That's the way history is. That's the way people behave. I don't know why, actually. I'm explaining individual behavior and national behavior is quite difficult, and I would say any explanation someone would put forward would be very, very speculative. I had no reason to worry about that. I'm just reporting an empirical finding. In this world, as far as we know, that doesn't happen. National traditions represent real events. Every time we've been able to check a national tradition about a national experience which was significant, it's turned out to be true. So that's the world we live in. The world we live in is that these kinds of traditions turn out to be true. It's an empirical argument. It has nothing to do with possibility.
You're saying it's not logical then? It's not based
I think empirical evidence is very logical. I think we base most of our beliefs around the world on the basis of empirical evidence.
You don't have a logical understanding of why it doesn't happen, though.
No.
You just.
I mean, a great deal of science is dedicated to researching why things that we know happen.
Right, you haven't.
The fact that we don't know why it happens does not cast any doubt whatsoever that it happens. Well, my conclusion follows from the fact that it happens. I don't need any more than that.
Okay.
That's a very, very important misunderstanding. Nowhere do I talk about relying on what could happen or couldn't happen. I never say that it couldn't happen. I give away possibilities straight away. The only thing that I rely on is the fact that empirically, in human history, it hasn't happened.
Okay. I understand how the Kuzari principle will help us in, let's say, a large thing. Let's say we want to talk about Matan Torah. Yes, we know that Torah was given at Sinai. That's a major event. Yeah, and so we know that the Torah we got, and also that the fact that the scrolls have been passed down. So we know the Torah B'chsav is also what we got. Yeah, and then also you can say even Torah B'al Peh, which wasn't passed down as in a written form until 2,000 years ago. Yeah, at least the main points I can understand. Yeah, that it's impossible to have the Torah B'chsav without having Torah B'al Peh. When we come to the fine points, yeah, the small little details. Yeah, how do you know that came down?
I agree that the argument that I've put forward doesn't address that. But at a certain point, one has to put the question that you're asking about a body of information into a larger context. You have a body of information, you know, you have good reason to believe that its outlines are correct. You have a good reason to believe that its basic and fundamental points have been transmitted accurately. If somebody says, how do you know the details have been transmitted? I want to understand the status of his question. Where are you starting from? Zero? Are we now talking about a coin found in China that somebody says was minted yesterday rather than 1,000 years ago? What are we talking about? We're talking about a framework that already exists, whose foundations are already established, ones that we can rely upon. Now, this is associated information in the same tradition. At that point, I would say, do we have any evidence indicating that it wasn't passed down correctly and accurately? No. Then I think by default, I would say that since the fundamentals have credibility, then the details should be given credibility until unless somebody can point out that a failure has taken place. No one says everything was remembered correctly. No one says that. No one ever claimed that. No one says that everything was always understood correctly. No one says that. We know that there were failures of understanding, there were failures of memory. They're recorded. Many of them are recorded in our tradition. So we're talking about the vast, vast majority. What I would do is take at least a section of our history that's later and talk about, let's say, from the time of the Mishnah, and talk about what accuracy we have that was transmitted accurately over time and understood accurately over time. And then I would point out that you're getting an aspect of a certain culture. And for someone to say, well, starting 2,000 years ago, we know things were kept accurately, carefully, and critically, and hypercritically, and so forth and so on. Before that, people were really behaving like giraffes. To postulate a radical cultural discontinuity like that is against human experience.
Well, we do say that. Until then, it was passed down père, orally, until that point. So it's much harder to get it accurate. If you've got a written text, you can always copy it letter for letter. When you pass it down orally, it's completely different.
Are you responding to what I said about giraffes? It doesn't sound like it. Doesn't sound like it. Did you understand what I said about giraffes? Did you understand my point? I don't think so. So the first thing you got to do is ask, what did you mean by that point? I didn't get it. You're so programmed into your next objection that you're not listening to what I'm saying. That's not a way to carry on a dialogue. Right? When you can examine a culture at a certain time, and you see certain cultural characteristics, for someone to base his position on saying, well, yes, for the last 2,000 years, the culture behaved this way. But before that, it behaved in a fundamentally different way. He's in a weak position. No. A culture behaving in a fundamentally different way.
No, it did. It was a completely different way. Before Rebbe wrote down the Mishnah, it was 1,500 years before that. Yeah. We passed it on orally.
What does that have to do with a culture behaving in a fundamentally different way? Were the people critical, or were they intelligent or unintelligent? Were they literate or illiterate? Did they care about social norms or didn't they care about? That's a fundamental cultural thing. This is a matter of strategy of preserving information. That's not a fundamental cultural norm. Here we know we have a pasuk that we base it on. We have a decision at a particular time. We date it. We know exactly who made the decision, why made the decision. That's not a fundamental cultural change. It would be like saying that. If all Americans today were nonviolent, and say in the Wild West, everybody was shooting everybody at liberty, and then 100 years ago, everybody stopped and everybody became nonviolent. That would be very questionable, you would say. Cultures don't change like that. I don't think radical transformations of that type. You read the dialogues in the Torah, which go back at least 2,500 years. For us, they go back 3,300 years. They sound like a modern Israeli taxi driver. Did you take us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? What kind of foolish play was that? A modern Israeli taxi driver would talk exactly the same way. That's a cultural norm, how you deal with irony, how you deal with frustration. Do you rebel, don't you rebel? Jewish rebellion is as old as the Torah, and it's been going on consistently since the Torah, right? So a stiff-necked group, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. This is as old as, these are cultural norms. Whether you choose to write something down or communicate it orally is not a cultural norm. It's a strategy for preserving information for one reason or another. So I don't see it. And I say that someone who's going to say, well, once it became written down, then suddenly there became an attitude of critical thinking and questioning and debate and argument and resistance to arbitrary change. But before that, things were very fluid and people accepted whatever they were told and they changed their minds without even knowing they changed their minds. That's a radical cultural discontinuity. Someone who has to assert that owes us strong evidence that that happened. We know that that's not the way cultures behave. So I don't think that's a serious problem. Okay, let's go on here.
I have a question. What are the principles of Chassidut, and how did the Baal Shem Tov spread around? Like, what is the idea behind it?
Okay. I think I'll have to preface this by saying that there are many partisan views in this subject, many views that try to put forward a particular slant depending upon their particular Hasidic group. Of course, I'm perfectly objective, and I don't do that. And my view is true, and the others are all slanted. So I'm just telling you that as the introduction. Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a noted philosopher of the mid-20th century, pointed out that some concepts don't have precise definitions. Many concepts don't have precise definitions, but they don't have definitions at all. They are what he called family resemblance concepts. Meaning, if you take this concept and you look at the things that exhibit that concept, so you'll find a variety of characteristics, and each thing that falls under that concept has some selection of the characteristics, but no particular characteristic is necessary, nor is it sufficient for possessing the concept. His example was game. Right? Must game must game be a competition? There are solitary games. Must games have winning and losing? No, there are games that are played for the sake of just seeing how well you do. Must games have two competitors? No, there are multi-competitor games. Whatever you want to say, but we do recognize what games are on the basis of the fact that there are family resemblances among the various things called games. I think Hasidus is like that also. There are certain principles that are typical of Hasidic groups. Typical does not mean universal. It means typical. Maybe 60, 70% will have each one of these characteristics, but it'll be a different 60, 70% as you go around the characteristics, and there'll be differences of priority. So you have to get a sense of the typical features of Hasidus, but not thinking that when I say it's a typical feature, we found in every group, because I don't think it's like that. I think it's a family resemblance concept the way Wittgenstein talked about it. Okay, so I'll give you some of these typical characteristics. One is an emphasis on joy. Of course, the Torah starts and ends with responsibility. Our responsibility requires sober, careful reflection, consulting with experts to get expert advice, taking life seriously, but one can have all those characteristics and perform Beethoven with great joy. The idea that joy should be expressed, that joy is an important part of life, that joy should be emphasized, is something which the Hasidic movement in general typically emphasized. Another one, and this is related sort of emotionally, but in content it's a different statement. Progress. A person wants to improve himself. There are really two different ways to improve oneself. One is to repair one's faults. That's what usually comes to mind when you talk about self-improvement. The other is to increase or advance one's successes. Not one's faults, but one's successes. In fact, most normal self-improvement falls into the second category. If you're a whiz with equations and you can't tell anxiety from joy, you don't become a psychologist, you become a mathematician. Because you're working with what you're already good at. That's what you dedicate yourself to. If you're a whiz at putting a medium-sized ball into a basket or a hoop and hitting a tiny ball with a stick is beyond you, you don't become a golfer, you become a basketball player. You do what you're already good at. Now, there are two different schools of thought how one should improve oneself in terms of one's Jewish performance, identity. The Hasidic movement stressed starting with what you're already good at. Don't start by facing your failures. Start by taking the things you're good at and improving them. That has obvious psychological benefits. I would rather do anything than face my failures. I'd rather move bricks than face my failures. But if you tell me to improve the things I'm good at, I feel comfortable there. I feel positive there. I asked my rabbis, that's how the Boston Rebbe, what about making a daily accounting of one's activities or a weekly accounting, which some sources stress. He said it's a worthwhile idea, but when you start to think about the period of time and how well you did, first pick something that you succeeded at and dwell on it, polish it till it glows, and then move on to the other things where you might not have done so well and work on those. A third element that's typical in the Hasidic movement, we have what's called exoterica, things that are open and obvious, recommended that everyone should study, and that are expressed in more or less literal terms. If you take it at face value, more or less at face value. And then there's esoterica, which in our case usually involves what's called Jewish mysticism. Some portion of Jewish mysticism simply gives a deeper insight into the exoterica. Esoterica gives a deeper insight into the exoterica. The Hasidic movement typically explained those parts of Jewish mysticism that deepen our understanding of the performances of various common everyday mitzvos, or verses in the Torah, or passages in the Siddur, things that you're going to come across anyway to give you a deeper understanding of them. There is also systematic Jewish mysticism. Some Hasidim studied that, but I think it was a considerable minority. It was not a majority at all. But this applied Jewish mysticism is something which was very typically used. Yeah.
So I have a question, two questions based on what you said. You said they focus on joy. What exactly is joy for them? Since you said you could play piano and that's joy for you.
Oh, of course. I just meant the point of the example of the piano was just if you play the piano seriously, it requires considerable study. It requires practice and coordination, and requires thought and criticism and so forth and so on. But when you play a piece by Beethoven, you're flying. So there's no inconsistency between being serious, dedicated, and making an effort to do things as best you can on the one hand, and experiencing joy. There's no contradiction between them. It isn't that the seriousness of the effort cancels out the joy. It makes it drudgery. It just makes it duty. There's no inconsistency. That's all I meant by that. Now, in our case, of course, joy doesn't mean taking a pill and getting a high. It doesn't mean drinking or injecting substances to get high. It means being conscious of one's closeness to God. That's what creates joy in our case. The fact that you are connected to, close to, you're interacting with God.
Too.
That's right. But again, I should have mentioned this before I started this list. The Hasidic movement invented nothing. That's what I told you. Some people are going to say differently. The only thing I can say is they're wrong. The Hasidic movement invented nothing. Everything in the Hasidic movement comes from older verses in the Tanakh, statements in the Talmud, in the Midrash, older themes. Only some of them had fallen into disuse, and the Hasidic movement resurrected them. Some had become devalued, and the Hasidic movement felt it was important to put a priority on them. But in my study of Hasidism, I have found absolutely nothing that the Hasidic movement invented. Another element of Hasidic life is emphasis on the group. Group activities, group solidarity, group interaction between the leader of the group and the group, where there's a mutual dependency between the two of them, that's something which the Hasidic movement stressed to a great deal. Okay, that's a few of the elements, and I will say something else, which this is not really my own opinion. I think it's pretty obvious, but if someone disagrees with me, I would be inclined to take him seriously. It just seems to me that you can look at what the Hasidic movement did in this way, that the Hasidim imported from the Sephardi world elements which they implanted in the Ashkenazi world in Europe. Uh-huh. The emphasis on the Chacham, who is the leader of the community and who's revered and who everyone interacts with, was translated into the idea of a Rebbe. The emphasis of the group, the emphasis on mysticism. I mean, the Sephardim swamp everybody in their commitment to Jewish mysticism, but it was rarely learned outside of the intelligentsia. The great leaders of Ashkenazi Jewry were all masters in Kabbalah. The Gaon of Vilna, many say, was the greatest master of Kabbalah in the whole generation. So it was known, but it was only known by the very few. In the Sephardi world, 12-year-olds can recite passages from mystical tracts, about, by memory. I don't know how much they understand, but it was open, it was talked about, it was discussed, it was taught in public, right? And the Hasidim borrowed some of that. I think of the Hasidic movement, and they borrowed some of the order of prayer. They borrowed some of the form of prayer. And the Hasidic form of prayer really imported Sephardi elements and transplanted them into the Ashkenazi world.
So Baal Shem Tov was considered the rabbi who imported these elements from the Sephardi to the Ashkenazim?
That's a good question. Now I'm up against the wall of my ignorance. What he did was he emphasized the spiritual and social themes, and he went from community to community, simply raising people's consciousness. He didn't have a fixed congregation. He didn't stay in one place long enough to have a fixed congregation. He traveled around, and many people became inspired. It was the Maggid of Mizrich who came after him, who set up a school and trained 36 people to be local Hasidic leaders, rabbis, and he sent them out, designated them to various areas of Eastern Europe. And that's when the organized Hasidic movement started. As far as I know, I could be wrong about this, as far as I know, the Baal Shem Tov didn't plant any communities, he didn't set up any schools, he simply went and talked to people. And
let his Talmidim spread it around.
Right, people who came in contact with him and were inspired by him and then talked to others. It was like a grassroots growing movement, but was totally disorganized. It was the Maggid of Mizrich who organized it. Okay, that's at least a little bit on the Hasidic movement.
Very good, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, next, who else is, yeah.
Okay, so my question is that we just read Parshas Bereshis and Noach. So my question is, how can we reconcile like the story of the creation of Adam and the story of Noach and the dispersion with scientific and archaeological evidence?
Well, what particular scientific and archaeological evidence would you like to?
What I mean by that is that, from my understanding, is at the time of when the Mabul happened, there's no signs that a society ceased to exist in the world, if that makes sense. So the Egyptians are building the pyramids, the North Americans, South Americans are still living there. There's no sudden stop and then a repopulation of the world, if that makes sense. Also,
how did you ascertain this? You looked through their histories and found continuity in every case?
Yeah, but just on that, so a lot of cultures have a story of a flood. So
No, I'm talking about, don't change the subject. I asked.
From my understanding, yes, there was continuity.
From your understanding, did you actually take out the books and look at 3,500 years ago and check the? I have an article a research done by a fellow at Liverpool University, Rabbi Gottlieb, one of my teachers, brought it to my attention, and I can email it to you, where he finds a 200 to 400 year discontinuity in cultures all over the world. All over the world. If you send me an email, I'm happy to send you a copy of that research. So on the contrary, there is direct evidence of worldwide discontinuity of cultures at the same time.
Okay, so then my next question comes to Adam, because there's evidence that there were civilizations thousands of years before Adam was born. So then how do we reconcile that?
Well, we have a definition of humanity, and the scientific world has a definition of humanity. Since we are defending our story, we get to use our definition. Now, the scientific world defines humanity partly by DNA, which is largely incompetent because no one can trace the things back. It's either 800,000 years or 3 million years or somewhere in between, and that's a pretty big discrepancy to say that you're dealing with a scientific story. But the defining characteristics are bodily characteristics and intelligence. If we find bones and general size of the cranium, and so on and so on, and you find signs of intelligence, that for them makes it in the human family, and then you whittle it down depending upon how seriously you take this particular minor characteristic. Our definition of human being is a bodily form, intelligence, morality, and spirituality. Adam, after all, committed a crime and was punished for it. God spoke to Adam. He had prophecy. So humanity for us requires 4 characteristics. body, intelligence, morality, and spirituality. So now I ask, what evidence do I have in paleontology for a creature before Adam that had all four characteristics? Bodily form, we have some evidence. And intelligence, we have some evidence. But I want to know, where's the evidence for those other two defining characteristics? Now I'll make a statement which I'm making on the basis of philosophy, and if you like, I can substantiate it for you. There can be no evidence of morality and spirituality without language. Understand clearly what I'm saying. We need to find specimens of their language and translate them and interpret them in order to have evidence of morality and spirituality. It's not a question of whether they had language, it's a question of what they talked about. If you don't find specimens of language and translate them, you will not have evidence of morality and spirituality. The oldest findings that are identified as language, last time I checked, are 5,500 years old, which is less than 5775, last time I checked. There's no linguistic remains that are agreed upon that are linguistic at all, and certainly none that have been translated to show what they thought about, what they cared about, what their ideas were, and without that, you're not going to have evidence of morality and spirituality. Take the wonderful cave paintings. I don't know if you've seen them, what you can find on the net from France, which they estimated 30,000 years ago. They're astonishing. They're astonishing. They're moving. They are evocative. You can see and feel the animals and in the pictures. They're amazing. Why did they paint those pictures? I think I've seen a dozen theories. One is because they're starving, and this is a kind of magic whereby they hope to be more successful in the next hunt. Second is they're celebrating a successful hunt. The third is that they like making pictures. They were good at it. They like making pictures. It's decoration. They're obviously good at it, and they're meaningful pictures, so they put them up. From the pictures themselves, you have no way to assess whether there's any morality or spirituality behind it. It's said that one of the creatures in the human family group, whether it's Homo sapiens sapiens or not, buried its dead. Okay, why did they do that? I saw a paleontologist say this clearly means they believed in God and they believed in the soul, and give me a break. Maybe the dead bodies stink. Maybe they thought it would improve the fertility of the soil. Maybe it's just a way of cutting off their grief, watching and seeing the dead person you love deteriorating could be very disturbing, so they bury him to get him out of the way. Without having linguistic remains, you're not going to have any evidence of morality and spirituality, and there aren't any linguistic remains, and even if there were, you'd have to translate them. It's not a question of whether they spoke languages or not. I don't think there's evidence for that either. But they're going to talk about continuity and so forth and so on. I'll give them that for the sake of the argument. I need to know what they talked about. And I think, frankly, it's quite remarkable. Since our limit is 5775, and there aren't any remains of language that go back before that, that itself is a nice coincidence, shall we say. So I'm not disturbed by the remains of those housing units and proto-agriculture and tools that they had and cave paintings. They do not do the job in disputing that Adam, out of 5775, was the first what the Jewish tradition calls human. That they are not a dispute to that. Yeah.
You can just follow up on this. Then, do we believe that Adam was literally created from the soil? Do we believe he evolved and then he was the first of this what we classify as human? So, is it?
Well, we believe that what it says in the book of Genesis is true. It means that God formed a body for him and breathed into him a soul of life, and he became a living creature. Unlike all of the others, which were not the sole activity of God, so to speak, in that respect, sole direct activity, though he was obviously present and active in all the stages. And that means it's a brand new beginning. It's a brand new beginning. Yeah.
5,500 years, you said, we have, that's the last remaining language. But when did Adam die? And it wasn't the first language Hebrew. So.
Listen again. I said 5,500 years is the oldest samples of language, actual inscriptions, right? I didn't say, I said several times, I'm not talking about when people were speaking or not speaking. The question is not, did they have language? The question is, what did they talk about? How am I going to know what they talked about? Only by finding samples of their language and translating them. Even if you told me that people were speaking languages 50,000 years ago. But what did they talk about? You have no idea unless you find samples of their language and translate them and see what they're talking about.
So we have samples of 5,500 years ago.
Yes, but Adam is 5775. Okay. He's worried about our reconciling ourselves with archaeology, paleontology before Adam. 5,500 is less than 5775.
So, but isn't Adam the first language? So there's 200 years.
From our point of view, but so what?
So 200 years, then the languages were written down. The Tower of Babel was way longer after that, and
much longer after that.
Right. So the first only language was actually Hebrew. So therefore, that should be Hebrew, 5,500 years ago.
And what have you got against that?
So my question is to you: is the scribes that were found 5,500 years ago Hebrew?
Oh, that okay, fine. So now let me tell you what this Yerushalmi. It's a very interesting Yerushalmi. We just read it, right? The story of the dispersion, right? The Tower of Babel. The Torah starts off by saying, "Vayihi kol haaretz sofa achas u'devorim achadim." The whole world was one language and one set of ideas. There is a source that says the following: there were many different human groups, and each local human group had its own different language. And in addition to the local different languages, there was one international language. And that's what it means when it says it was one language. It means there was a single international language that everyone spoke. And then there were, in addition, local different languages. Okay. And because you had one international language, no one bothered with bilingual translations. Why would you translate Serbian into Los Angeles, which is another language, right? When everybody speaks Greek. Everybody speaks Greek. You talk to someone from Los Angeles, talk to someone in Serbia, they're going to talk Greek. So what happened was, in the Tower of Babel, God caused them to forget the one universal language. Then they were left with their own individual languages, and they couldn't communicate. There's not a clear statement that there was only one language. It says there was one language. It doesn't mean there weren't other languages. There was one universal language, and there were, in addition, other languages. And in fact, one source that I saw said that Noah took samples of those languages with him on the ark so that afterwards they could be recreated. So if you find archaeological evidence of multiple languages going back before the flood, we have no problem with that. The Torah does not say that there weren't specific languages before the flood. The Torah simply says that in addition to the specific languages, there was one universal language.
But the Kuzari says that there must be a real reason for people to change their language. Everyone spoke Hebrew. There must have been a reason for them to suddenly start speaking different languages, which is proof, logical proof for the Tower of Babel, saying that there's no way everyone would have started speaking just randomly a different language. But you're saying that even before the Tower of Babel, people spoke their own languages.
So this, first of all, I don't remember the Kuzari saying that, but it could be the last time I learned the Kuzari was a long time ago. It could be so, but that he's saying on his own. Let's understand, when we're talking about the Jewish tradition, we have no brief that everything that a medieval commentator says is true. Medieval commentators can make mistakes. If we had reliable evidence that languages existed beforehand, then that little piece of logic in the Kuzari would turn out not to be correct. Right?
And what do you do about it? Why is that not logical then?
Because it's based on a false premise of fact.
That what?
I'm taking your word for what the Kuzari says.
Right.
The way you're portraying it is like this. If you imagine people, all of whom are speaking one language altogether. Hebrew. And then you find at a certain time lots of different languages, you have to explain that. People don't just decide, let's stop speaking this language and make up another language. That doesn't happen. So now he says that would be an argument that some incident like the Tower of Babel must have happened. Otherwise, how are you going to explain that discontinuity?
If you say it if you're saying it from Adam, Adam, I assume, spoke one language most of the time.
Yes.
So how did you get between, let's say, before the Tower of Babel, before Noah, all that time there were all these different languages? How did that happen?
Well, I suggest that you take out English literature from 600 years ago. You can't read it. You can't pronounce it. You don't know what it means. That's only 600 years. The way people speak naturally evolves. It naturally changes. There are people separated in geography. The fact that they're going to naturally change. But if you think that there was a sudden discontinuity, then you have to explain that. People don't volunteer to do this. It happens insensibly. What did somebody tell me? That about 400 or 500 years ago in English, nice meant bow-legged, something like that. I mean, things have definitely changed. Chaucer. You take a look at Chaucer. That's 800 years. Can't read a word. So things change naturally, and in different places they're going to change differently. How many different dialects do you have in England today? From southern England to, I won't talk about Scotland. That's another planet. But northern London, southern London. And you go in America. Take somebody from New England, somebody from Louisiana. It's hard for them to understand one another. Yeah. What else is on people's minds?
How do you actually? What you're saying that you've got no problem with human bodies, let's say, understanding humans, yeah, but the bodies that resemble humans existing before other.
That's right.
So,
no problem. It's not an objection to us. Nowhere do we predict that you won't find human bodies, existing before Adam. We haven't talked about the existence of time before Adam. That's a separate issue. We can talk about that. But the idea of human beings existing before can be answered with a local answer. Namely, they don't fit our definition of human.
How do you carry on with the 6 days? How do you?
Okay.
How would you reconcile 30.8 billion to 6 days? That's
Yeah. So Maimonides fought this battle 900 years ago with a much stronger adversary, because according to all ancient thinking, including the great authority Aristotle, the world has no beginning at all. 30.8 billion is paltry against infinity. And here's what Maimonides said. This is in part 2, chapter 17 of the Guide, where he gives the following parable to answer this question. And then I'll explain to you the philosophy behind it. Imagine a baby boy that's born, and shortly after his birth, he's taken by his father to a community of only men. He grows up in that community. At a certain age, he asks the adults, the older adults, where do we come from? Where do people come from? He's in a community of only men. There's no births. So he's told, every one of us starts out as a tiny miniature inside the body of someone who's very much like us, but different in certain respects. He starts out inside the body as a tiny miniature and is there for many months. And then he comes out and he grows to become the way you see us. So the boy says, well, we are miniatures inside the body of that other. Can we breathe? Can we eat? Can we drink? And the answers are, of course, no. So the boy says, then I know your story is false. Everyone knows that if you don't breathe for 4 minutes, you're dead. If you don't drink for 3 weeks, you're dead. If you don't eat for 2 months, you're dead. Everybody knows that. You're telling me an impossible story. You can't be right. Now, according to the world in which he's living, he's right. There is no life like that. There's no life without breathing. There's no life without drinking. There's no life without eating. The truth is that the adults are describing to him a world that's utterly unlike anything he has seen. Operates according to different laws, different principles, different structures, different interactions, utterly unlike anything that he has seen. Says Maimonides, the 6 days of creation are the gestation of the world.
What does that mean, gestation?
Pregnancy. So the world is pregnant. What we call the laws of nature started operating at the end of the 6th day. Before that, our laws of nature aren't operating. We who live in a world that's post-Genesis, and we see our laws, we, like that boy who thinks of post-birth male human life, we think that our world, with our laws, is universal, always has been the same, and I can project it backwards without any limitations. That's what we think. We're making the same mistake as that boy made. As a matter of fact, the world started off in a period in which our laws of nature didn't apply. Maybe there's some overlap, but the general picture of our laws of nature doesn't apply. That's the 6 days. That being the case, our interactions, our limitations of causality, and all the rest don't apply to that period. So now, someone wants to say, but radioactive decay and the speed of light in a vacuum and radiation of heat into space. We know how all these things work, and we know what their time periods are, and the half-lives of the radioactive isotopes and all the rest of it. Sure, you know how the world works from the end of the 6th day on. But projecting back before that is simply a free projection. I mean, it's a free world. You can assume what you like, but you're just assuming it. And from my point of view, it's a mistake. And by the way, Rabbi Meisman, who I mentioned before, who just put out a book, a 900-page book on Torah and science, found Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, had a similar view on scientific grounds. He said that the laws of nature have been evolving. They have not been constant. And that being the case, projecting to the distant past using constant laws of nature is simply inadequate. It's incompetent, not scientifically defensible. So as far as the time period, we say it's 5775, and before that was 6 24-hour periods. That's why I mentioned overlap, because you have to account for time, even though, as Rabbi Meisman shows in his research, there are a variety of views about time, but that's one way to do it. There's overlap, but a great deal of what's going on there is not according to what we call the laws of nature. Now, if you'll ask, but if so, what about all the evidence that science finds of older age? How do you account for the evidence? Okay, there's no proof that it's really older, but where does the evidence come from? There are 2 ways to do this. I'm going to give you the way that's intuitively less challenging, psychologically more comfortable. Playing to the audience now. I think there are other solutions that are just as good philosophically, but this one's certainly good. This is what Rabbi Schwab wrote in an article on the subject, and that is, he said, everything that the scientists say happened. It all happened. It's all true. It just happened much faster. Millions of times faster. Hundreds of millions of times faster. It all happened. The pterodactyls flew in the air, and the slugs, and Burgess Shale, the Cambrian explosion. All these things happened. They just happened much faster. You'll tell me, but to happen that many times faster is going to break laws of nature? Correct, it certainly will, because the laws of nature weren't functioning then. We said that already. We're not worried about that. We already said that explicitly. So yes, they're all laid down. All the things are laid down. 2 normal objections are raised to this. Oh, does that mean we're dealing with a jokester God, a God who just sets out to deceive us? Elliot Sober, who is an eminent philosopher of biology, and he's a good philosopher. He's a good philosopher. But when he, like many others, strays over into theology, he becomes a fool. He should stick to the subject that he knows and not speculate about subjects he doesn't know. Does it mean that God is joking with us or deceiving us? So Rabbi Meisman points out, certainly not. He told us the truth, didn't he? He told us the truth. Okay, now you have a person who says, I don't believe in religion, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in holy scriptures or anything else. I only trust my eyes, my instruments, and my logic. Okay, it's a free world. You can do as you please. But you can't accuse God of deceiving you when God told you the truth and you just decided not to pay any attention. That's not his fault. Doesn't make him into a jokester. Maybe it makes you into a jokester, but doesn't make him into a jokester. The other objection that people raise is, but look at the policy. You're describing God as following. You're telling us that he created a world, and he created it so that when we look at it without his statement on record, without using his prophecy, it looks quite strongly as if it's constituted one way. But the truth is there's really something else. Okay, he told us, so he's not fooling us. But is that a policy that we should associate with God? Is it reasonable? Is it part of the Jewish tradition to associate with God a policy of creating the world looking one way when the truth of his existence is very, very different? The answer is we must associate that with God according to the Jewish tradition, because it is an axiom, an open axiom of the Jewish tradition. Those who pray, questionable, dangerous process, but one could try. Those who pray say it twice every morning. Twice every morning in the Siddur it said, God renews the work of creation continuously. God renews the work of creation continuously. Creation exists because God is pouring into it some kind of divine energy. By the way, this is a statement of Maimonides, the philosopher, in addition to the Kabbalists. And he says it twice. He says it in the Mishnah Torah and in the Guide of the Perplexed. Right? There's a continuous flow of divine energy maintaining the existence of the world. Does it look that way? No, it doesn't look that way. No scientist is going to discover that. Not with a microscope, not with a telescope, and not with computer models. You're not going to discover it. The world looks like it exists today because it existed yesterday and nobody annihilated it. It just carries on its own. It has its own existential inertia. It just floats on because it's been floating from before. That's the way it looks. And yet our tradition tells us it isn't that way. It isn't floating on its own. God's maintaining existence. Without his maintenance, it wouldn't exist. So, does God create the world looking one way when the reality is another way? For sure he does that. That's inescapable as part of the Jewish tradition. And this now becomes another example of it. He created it looking older and really isn't that old. It's not a questionable principle from the Jewish point of view at all. It's a necessary part of the Jewish tradition. You can ask why he did that. Okay, you can ask why. But asking why is always free.
Okay. You have an answer why he did that?
I can answer this. Why is a tricky question. If I know a person's an intelligent agent and I know he has a program and I see that this contributes to the program, at the very least I could say is that this contributes to his program. Could he have had other reasons for it? Sure. Additional reasons? Sure. But this contributes to his program. One element in God's program is that human beings should have free will. Free will means that God's presence has to be hidden. We say God hides. That doesn't mean he's absent. Indeed, if he's absent, calling him hiding is it's a weak concept. No, hiding means he's present, but he makes his presence invisible. God's presence would swamp free will. Indeed, that's how we understand why angels don't have free will, because he's present to them and he isn't hidden. And since he isn't hidden, his presence it swamps their free will. They can't choose to oppose him. So he hides his presence. Now, one way he hides his presence by making the world appear as if it carries itself. If we saw his creative activity in everything around us, we'd be swamped. A prophet, while he's having prophecy, is swamped. All but Moses had no free will when they had prophecy. They were just swamped, flattened. They couldn't stand up. They couldn't think. They had no control of their limbs, their reason, nothing. They were just wiped out by prophecy. The minute the prophecy passed, then they recovered their free will. They went back into a world in which his presence wasn't open. That's how Jonah, right after God tells him, go to Nineveh, he says, I'm going to Tarshish. Excuse me, I have another travel plan. I'm not going that way. But while the prophecy is going on, he can't rebel. Only Moses could stand up to the experience of prophecy. At any rate, God's presence has to be hidden, otherwise there'll be no free will. Now there's a variety of ways of hiding it. One way of hiding it for sure is that we shouldn't see his creative energy making everything work at the moment. The world looking older than it is another way in which the world doesn't look the way it really is, the way he created it. So there's room for us not to see his presence. By the way, the Talmud makes a statement about this, and my oldest son, from whom also I learned a great deal, made a very striking remark. The Gemara says everything that was created b'tzivyonam nivru. Tzivyonam, according to the commentators, means everything was created mature. It was created mature. Adam was created as an adult. He wasn't created as a baby, he had to grow up. He was created as an adult. The trees in the Garden of Eden, we assume, had tree rings because they were created as mature trees. You meet Adam 5 minutes after he's created, you think he's 30 years old. But he isn't, he's 5 minutes old. Now the Talmud says everything is like that. Everything is like that. Everything is created looking mature, that is to say, looking as if it had a prehistory. So my son said, if we had any idea of the dimensions of the planet we're living on, we could have predicted decayed radioactive isotopes and light in space and all the rest, because that's just signs of maturity. It's that the Earth isn't young. It doesn't look young. It looks as a body, which roughly now they think are close to 5 billion years old. We could have predicted those signs of age because everything was created that way, including the planet, not just the trees and the human being and the animals. So this contributes to God's program of hiding his presence, and therefore contributes to the program of free will. That's certainly something that it does that's in line with a project we know God has. I'm sure there's more, maybe even endless other contributions that it makes, but this is one thing that could be used to partially explain it.
Well, what is, when we're this Friday, read the Korbanot, what is a Korbanot? Like, why does it say Yan Kaprisin and what does it talk about?
Why the Korbanot? Let's sit down for about 6 or 7 hours and I'll give you a survey. Korbanot is a gigantic subject. What are you talking about?
Well, why we read it in the Siddur?
Why do you read it in the Siddur?
Yeah.
Because the Gemara says that studying the laws of the sacrifices is the gesture that we can make when we don't have the real sacrifices.
Okay, I understand that.
That's the best we can do, and it's a gesture that gives us some merit relevant to what they had when they brought it. But it's not a substitute. Many people make a mistake. They say it too strong. It's not a substitute. For example, if I commit an action that requires a sacrifice, and I study the laws, and then the temple's rebuilt, I have to bring the sacrifice. You can't say, I studied the laws, so I'm finished with that. No, it's what you can do when you can't bring the sacrifice.